Today's reading from the book of Proverbs awakens our hearts and calls us to Christian action. Like a stream is the king's heart in the hand of the Lord. Whatever it pleases him, he directs it. All the ways of a man may be right in his own eyes, but it is the Lord who proves hearts. To do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. The book of Proverbs is included in a genre of spiritual writings called wisdom literature. Professor John Collins of Yale Divinity School explains that wisdom literature is basically instructional literature that comes from sayings, or what Professor Collins calls good advice. Wisdom, it should also be noted, is not the same thing as knowledge, but rather the proper use of knowledge, or good judgment. While today's reading from Proverbs includes a series of wise sayings, I would like to focus on 3 verses that seem to rise to the surface of my own consideration each time I read this passage. First, all the ways of a human may be right in one's own eyes, but it is the Lord who proves hearts. Does this resonate with you? Isn't it natural to believe our own beliefs and actions are right and just? Other people or systems are the source of injustice and evil, not me. The proverb reminds us that we may not be the best judge of our own self-righteousness. Rather, God tests our hearts. God calls us to holiness. How is God testing our hearts at this moment of time? The Proverbs continue. To do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Reading this verse, I can't help but think of chapter 5 from the book of Amos, verses 21 to 24. I will never forget the lecture my Old Testament professor, Michael Coogan, gave on this passage. I despise your feasts. I take no pleasure in your solemnities. Take away from me your noisy songs, the melodies of your harps. I will not listen to them. For me, as a singer, I was at first astonished by these verses. I love ritual and liturgy and singing. The prophet Amos proclaims that God despises our earnest rituals and songs. But in the next verse, the prophet affirms what truly pleases God. Rather, let justice surge like waters, and righteousness like an unfailing stream. You may recognize this final verse from a famous speech made by Dr. Martin Luther King. These words also inscribed on the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, designed by Maya Lin and sponsored by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Instead of traditional rituals, self-righteous pronouncements, and performative displays of virtue, the prophet affirms that God demands right action and justice. Our nation and world seem to be crying out for justice. What right action can we do? Let's turn back to Proverbs. Today's reading concludes, "He who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will himself also call and not be heard." He who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor. Earlier this week, I read a story from the September 1st edition of the New York Times titled, "Young People Are Fighting Hunger and Finding Purpose." Some of you know that I teach high school and also enjoy reading and learning more about adolescent development and frankly reflecting on my own experience of schooling. I have attached this article to the homily, and I encourage you to read the full piece. In short, the article points to research showing that volunteering increases empathy and a sense of purpose. And during the pandemic, it is helping some fight off depression and social isolation. Let me share a few excerpts of this story. Quote, "At a time of rising political polarization, reaching out to serve others can renew one's sense of shared national identity and purpose," says Harvard developmental psychologist Richard Weisbord. Quote, "We have a lot of Americans who are vulnerable and suffering right now," he said. To the extent that we are all Americans, each one of us is responsible for all of us. That's an attitude that we want to cultivate in young people. And later in the story, quote, "The future of our democracy may depend on restoring this ethic of mutual caring," says James Eunice, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Catholic University of America here in Washington. He participated in a 2007 study that showed that students who engaged in service projects in high school volunteered more often and voted in higher numbers later in life. Quote, "There's something bigger than themselves out there," Dr. Eunice said. "It's not just about getting into a good college, it's what I can be as a person, what I can contribute." End quote. He who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will himself also call and not be heard. Perhaps our God is calling us today, in moments of our own or others' suffering and sorrow, isolation and uncertainty. Wisdom calls us not to trust in ourselves or our own knowledge, what is right in our own eyes, but rather to allow God to prove our hearts, to hear the cry of the poor, to do what is right, and let justice surge.